good evening. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us here tonight. Really looking forward to tonight's presentation on the phenomenon of home DNA testing. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest speaker. So Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture and science. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Atlantic, and Smithsonian Magazine. Her new book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published by Abrams in 2020. In it, she explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says the book is a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, quote, "Before you spit in that vial, read this book," unquote. The Washington Post says the book reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life, such as who are we, what is family, and are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? And the book was recently named to the Guardian's list of the best books of 2020. So all 20 of us or so that are watching live here on Zoom, and those that will watch the recording later on YouTube, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Libby for joining us here tonight. And Libby, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's really delightful, and I love that I can see people's faces. It's really lovely. So thank you for joining me tonight.
And we're taking a different tact for this particular meeting. I have a list of about 25 questions. I probably will ask about a third of those, but I have some questions that I definitely want to get to with Libby. So we'll do this for approximately 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to leave the last 15 minutes of questions to the audience. So while I'm asking questions and you're thinking, gosh, I wish he would ask about that, or oh, I have a better question, you keep those, okay, in mind, and we'll get to you around 7:45, I promise. So Libby, the first question I wanted to ask you right off the bat, I think this makes logical sense, is why did you write The Lost Family? Why did you publish your book last year?
Yeah. So I've been a journalist for over 20 years. I started my career at the Washington Post. I spent half my career there, and then I moved on to other publications, magazines, and newspapers. And one of the things that's always fascinated me is the way that technology moves in our lives, and sometimes the kind of unforeseen ways in which it changes us, the invisible force of technology, and the way we can't always anticipate the way it's going to play out. So that had been a running theme. I'd written about a lot of science writing. I'd done a lot of writing about people's inner lives and their psychologies, and their kind of their how people make decision making, and their moral compass, and their how people define their identities, and all that kind of stuff. And then I also had this interest in technology and in science. And it kind of like all those interests kind of came together when I was in conversation with one of my editors at the Washington Post about 4 years ago. And we were talking about home DNA testing, which at the time was, pretty popular, but not nearly as popular as it is now in terms of people who have actually done it and knowledge about it. And was this kind of fascinating treasure trove of information that people were discovering about their ancestors, about their families through DNA testing coupled with genealogy. And then, in addition to that, there was what we're hearing kind of bubbling up was this subset of people who were able to make discoveries that could not have been made any other way, and sometimes that they weren't even anticipating, right? In some cases, this was people who were adopted who had been blocked from access to their identities of their birth parents and had used DNA testing to get around the lack of access to those original birth certificates. And in other cases, they were people who kind of entered into this maybe with not much in the way of expectations, casual consumers who were just doing this on a lark. And then they got the news that they were, I don't know, not related genetically to their father, right? And that's the kind of, I was really interested in this idea that that this technology could answer questions, in some cases, questions that you had not even realized that you were posing. So I wrote about the phenomenon of home DNA testing and all the kind of wealth of knowledge, of personal knowledge and historical knowledge that it can bring. And I kind of told a sort of a detective story in the Washington Post. And the story kind of went viral and it got reprinted at a bunch of places. And I started suddenly getting all this email from readers, people in the United States, people abroad who had done DNA testing and they wanted to share their stories. And in many cases, their stories were revelations, kind of to them that had changed the way they saw themselves and changed the way they saw their place on this earth. I mean, really kind of profound revelations. And then I started talking to these people and I realized that this was a really big deal. That in many ways, DNA testing represents the end of family secrets. That in many ways, it represents a kind of grand moment of intergenerational reckoning, where people are learning all the ways they came into the world that they weren't necessarily told. People are learning about kind of past taboos that took place in families that were covered up maybe for a single lifetime or maybe for generations. And this was the moment when they were making these discoveries and having to kind of process and contextualize them and make peace with them. And it occurred to me that this was a kind of a massive change for the American family. In fact, a seismic cultural change for America. And I say America because we're the ones who've taken to DNA testing. We're the ones who are really into genealogy for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about. And we're the ones who are in those databases like no other country. And so we're kind of a testing ground for how this plays out. And other countries are probably looking to us and saying, oh, like, how does this play out, right? And we can kind of show them by example how these changes of this technology in sometimes inadvertent ways have kind of trickled through the lives of countless Americans. All of this was like swirling in my mind as I was talking to people who had emailed me. And as I was, sort of getting on the phone and interviewing them and learning their stories. And I just thought, this is like, we're in the middle of this huge cultural moment. We're going to look back on it. We're going to say, wow, everything changed in that moment. I wanted to write a book about it. And that book became, I'm reversed. I don't know which way to point. But yeah, that book became The Lost Family.
Great. And so one of the fascinating stories that your book tells is of Alice. Let me look at my cheat sheet. What is Alice's name? Alice Collins. How am I doing? Plebuck?
Very close. It's
close enough. Playbook. Well, anyway, so without spoiling her really interesting story, could you explain why her singular quest provides such a powerful window into home DNA testing?
Yeah, totally. I'm somebody who writes nonfiction but loves fiction. And specifically, I love thrillers and whodunits, like Agatha Christie, and for a more recent reference, like Tana French. So, Tana French is this wonderful Irish-American suspense writer. She writes these murder mysteries that are just so gripping. And that was kind of my model, right? Like, I wanted to write nonfiction that was so compelling that you wouldn't be able to put it down. And it struck me that these journeys of genealogical and genetic discovery are actually essentially detective stories. And they are, because they are incredibly compelling, right? Because you are reconstructing and re-understanding the past. And because they're so incredibly personal and meaningful. And instead of being, essentially whodunits, right? Who killed so-and-so, they are, they're existential who am I's, right? They're kind of like a whodunit rewritten as a who am I. And So I came to the wanting to write the book with the idea that I needed a character who was going to be incredibly compelling, because I wanted to pull readers through the book, and I wanted all the kind of ideas and the philosophy and the science and stuff, right? All the kind of additional idea stuff to be, to kind of be unfolded in the course of like discovering a great story. Because fundamentally, uh, that's how we get our ideas across, is through great stories. And I think that's like the most important kind of duty that an author has, is to make the reader go through to the end. Um, so I found this incredible story, and I just, the first time I heard it, I just thought that like there's literally no way that that's true. But it was, and it's the story of a woman named Alice. She's a genealogist. We meet her in 2012. She lives out in Washington State. She's recently retired. She worked in technology. I'm telling you this because it's totally relevant. Her technological background and her analytical mind wound up being precisely the tool she would need to solve her own personal mystery. But anyway, she takes this DNA test in 2012 to augment her genealogical research. Now, she kind of knows where she comes from. She knows that she's Irish American on both sides. She knows that her paternal grandparents were Irish immigrants, and she's just looking to kind of broaden her search, because there's those kind of dead ends and those brick walls that you hit when you're doing paper trail research. And she was hoping that she could find some Irish cousins or some Irish American cousins, and that it would help her get a little further back in time into Ireland. So she takes this DNA test through Ancestry, which had just unveiled their DNA test at that time. And she gets back the results, and they don't make any sense, because they seem to be telling her that instead of being entirely Irish with some British and Scottish thrown in, she's half Ashkenazi Jewish. And that's like, what? They don't know what they're doing. I can't be. So she takes a test at 23andMe, which is another big company, right? And the 23andMe results they're the same. And that's when she realizes, okay, I have like a mystery on my hands. Like what could possibly be the explanation? And she spends the next 2.5 years trying to unravel it. What's kind of amazing about Alice is she has incredibly long odds to solving her case for a variety of reasons, which I explain. It's a bit of a needle in a haystack journey in it. That's why it takes her so long. But it's not any of the expected explanations. So Alice, being quite methodical, goes through all the theories, and she starts with the most likely, which is that, her dad wasn't genetically her dad, and that some other man was her genetic father. And so she investigates that, and she disproves it. And every other theory that would kind of explain things, she's able to disprove. She's not donor conceived. She's not adopted. She doesn't come from a community that hid their genetic ancestry to escape discrimination. And when she finally figures out the explanation for her mystery, it turns out to go back 100 years. And one of the pleasures of writing the book was I got to do all this incredible historical research going back a century to explain how she had gotten her story so wrong. But what's great about her as a kind of a narrative thread is, she allows me, she allows me to tell other stories, because I kind of am telling her story, and I'm talking about the phenomenon. She's exploring the possibility that she's the product of an NPE, or non-paternity event, not parent expected, or some people call it misattributed parentage. And she's exploring this, and as we see her exploring it, then we get to visit with other people who've had those stories. That's actually happened to them. They were the product of misattributed parentage. And same for late discovery adoptees who make this discovery through DNA, and people coming from communities that hid their genetic ancestries to escape discrimination. So there's kind of this suite of experience that Americans are facing right now, and it takes a lot of different shapes, and those stories are really fascinating, because if you pull out and do a bit of a 360, they look different depending on where you stand. Are you the person who spits into the vial? Are you the genetic father who's just being discovered? How do you feel about being discovered? So there's all these kind of stories that can be told from all these different angles. And so Alice is kind of the narrative thread. And then we peel off and we meet a lot of other people to kind of introduce us to the experience and the differences and the commonalities in making these incredible revelations through DNA testing.
I apologize for my phone ringing.
Oh, it's okay.
I think you had written that 37 million people around the world have done a home DNA test. I guess the majority of those people being Americans. And you said that America has reached a tipping point, was the phrase you used. Can you elaborate more on that and the consequences of all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think DNA testing is really fascinating. There's so many fascinating facets to it, right? I think genealogy is. I think the fact that we're in this moment when we're all doing genealogy and DNA testing is kind of amazing. I think it says a lot about where we are right now and about America, and the science and the kind of the cultural forces that have led us here. And then there's all these kind of ways in which this plays out, right? So when you talk about DNA testing, you're not just talking about spitting into a vial and how it potentially impacts your genealogical search, right? You're also asking and posing fascinating bioethical questions, uh, moral questions, questions about privacy. You are doing something that is scientifically so incredibly amazing that we couldn't even dream of doing it 20 years ago. Um, and it's also a big business, right? So there's all these kind of fascinating different kind of tentacles that touch together when you're talking about DNA testing, and that's why I think um, I don't know. I find it fascinating. Like I find that I think even if you haven't taken a DNA test, right, some of the issues that it raises around nature, nurture, and identity, ethnicity, and family, and all those things are really things that we've all kind of thought about that are kind of age-old human questions. So all of that said, one of the things that DNA testing is really doing in this moment is because we share these overlapping genetic segments with other people who have taken a test, even if we haven't, we are potentially impacted by this technology, right? And that is essentially the tipping point because we're almost at 40 million DNA test kits sold. As you said, the majority of them are in the US. And pretty much every American has at least a third cousin, at least one third cousin in the database, plus a whole lot of other cousins, right? Probably some closer too, but at the very least, a third cousin. And what is the significance of that? The significance of that is that you can potentially identify somebody who's not in a DNA database from a third cousin match. And so basically what that means is that if somebody is genetically related to you and looking for you, you're not invisible to them just because you're not in the database. So what does this mean? This means that sperm donors, anonymous sperm donors, are no longer anonymous. It means that parents who place their children for adoption are not anonymous either. It means that we're learning, in fact, about a lot of cases where mothers were coerced into placing their children for adoption. It means that we're learning about a lot of misdeeds by doctors who substituted, in some cases, their own sperm for the sperm of the purported donor who was supposed to be somebody else. We're learning all this kind of stuff, right? And then we're learning, in some cases, that people didn't ever know that their father was not genetically related to them, that some other man someplace else was. So if, for instance, somebody's looking for their father, it doesn't matter so much whether or not they're in the database, right? They can test and they can find that man's sister or that man's first cousin or that man's third cousin even, and do the genealogical research and then identify, if not their father, then maybe a set of brothers, and write a letter to all three of them and sort of, wait for a reply, which is a situation that I write about in my book. So it means that any one of us can potentially find out something about ourselves or our families or our health history, even if we've never taken a test. And so as a practical matter, right, the issues that I'm talking about, I think are relevant to everyone, but I also think like the kind of the nature nurture questions, right? The questions of like, what is the essential me, right? Who would I have been if I had been raised by that family across the street that I always wished I had, I always wished I was raised in their home. The questions about ethnicity, like, am I what I was raised, or am I what is in my genes that I just discovered now at age 50? The question of what is a father, right? is it the man who raised me? Is it this other man that I've discovered now is my genetic father? And if he's not dad, because I already have a dad who I adore, what do I even call him, right? All these incredible questions about family and ethnicity and selfhood are all now on the table for essentially for all Americans, not just those who've spit into a vial.
And one of the other implications to the rise in home DNA testing is solving cold case murders, Libby. And I think the
Yeah.
most probably the most well-known example is the Golden State Killer. But do you think it's fair for DNA test results that were obtained to illuminate family history? Is it fair for those to be used to solve crimes? What are your feelings on the ethics of
Right.
that?
I mean, yeah, this is kind of one of the big questions I ask in the book. Um, the Golden State Killer case was solved in, I want to say it was April of 2018. And I just sold the proposal and it happened. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to add another chapter to my book, right? Because it was it was unexpected to me. I did not see it coming. I think there are a lot of people who are in that world, deep in that world, who did. Because in fact, the techniques that were used to identify the Golden State Killer, who by the way was a murderer and rapist who operated in the 70s and 80s in California, and um, he murdered at least 13 people and raped at least 50 women. He was, again, not in the database, but he was identified by crime scene DNA. And he was identified using the same techniques that people who have adopted people and others have been using to identify their genetic parents for, at that point, um, 7 years. So it was not new in the sense that this concept that you could identify someone who wasn't in the database, that was not new. But the idea of applying it to to finding a criminal, to arresting a criminal, that was a leap. And it's not that law enforcement didn't have its own DNA databases. They did, but they're really, really limited in terms of the information they can give, in terms of the ability to do what's called a familial, long-range familial searching. And they're not the DNA that they are kind of storing and analyzing is not as informative. So the DNA that we give away when we spit into a vial, or that we have analyzed when we spit into a vial to understand our family history, is a treasure trove. I mean, it's so there's so much information in there, and police could do a lot more with it. So there was this big debate, and it continues to be this big debate around whether that's appropriate, right? In the beginning, some databases were used to identify him, and they didn't even know or give permission at first for them to be used that way. One of the databases that's a private for-profit database, gave permission to the FBI to come in and do this without telling their customers and in apparent in apparent circumvention of the contract that they had given to their customers. So it appeared to be not even consistent with their own terms, right? So that is a kind of a huge privacy question that has not really been resolved because we still don't have regulation around this. At the same time, there are a lot of people who say man, that guy was a bad guy. And they got him off the street, right? And there's now kind of an attitude. You see some legislation in some states trying to limit this. There's now almost an attitude of how can you take this incredible tool away? Which has at this point solved at least 200 cases, most of them cold cases. So I think it's a situation where it's incredibly complicated. Even, courts of law have not really made certain determinations on it. Hasn't really been tested because it hasn't been around that long. And we're going to see how far it's going to go. But it also probably, in the words of some of the bioethicists that I interviewed, could benefit from some guardrails so that we know here's where the cases where it's used, and but it's not going to be used for a robbery, right? But it's not going to be used for X, Y, Z. So we kind of have a sense of when it's permissible, because there is concern about a slippery slope.
So I think you wrote in your book that home DNA testing has been around for 20 years, or at least home DNA testing for ancestral purposes
Right.
has been around for 20 years now. Wondering if you could briefly discuss sort of the origins of the industry.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, if there are longtime genealogists here, which there are, and you've done your DNA, you probably know about Family Tree DNA, which is the oldest company in the US that offered this kind of DNA testing. And they were founded 21 years ago. Actually, they were founded in the late 90s, but they sent out their first DNA test kits in the spring of 2000, so 21 years ago. And, I mean, over and over, what I found when I was reporting the book was this idea that we're really bad prognosticators when it comes to technology. Like, we don't know how it's going to play out, right? We can't imagine, maybe that it's going to be used to catch the Golden State Killer, right? We can't imagine that there's going to be this tipping point where most of the US population is potentially affected by a technology in which only a small proportion has actually participated, right? And so by the same token, like when this technology came into being, it was seen as a completely niche item. It was seen as a completely having a very narrow appeal. Bennett Greenspan was a serial entrepreneur and a longtime genealogist going back to, I think, when he was 12 at his grandmother's Shiva, when he went around and started asking questions of older relatives. And he, in the late 90s, was doing his genealogy, and he hit a brick wall, and he realized that the one thing that he could use that the paper records could not give him to determine whether this potential long lost relative living in Argentina was in fact an actual relative was DNA. And he set about to try and see if he could actually get his hands on a DNA kit. And he was reading these scientific papers that were written by scientists who were using this in the lab to study human population and human genetics. And the story he tells is that he called a scientist on the phone on a Sunday at home and asked the guy if he would sell him a DNA kit. And the scientist was kind of like incredulous, like, no, we don't do that. Like, we use these in the lab. We don't sell these kits. And he had like an epiphany that maybe there were other people out there like him, kind of crazy, obsessive genealogists, as he put it, right? People who were really, really into this. And there might be a market. Because if he wanted it, maybe other people wanted it. So he persuaded the scientists to go into business with him, and they started Family Tree DNA. And it was at the time just Y DNA. So it was just like, looking at the DNA of the Y chromosome, which is passed down from father to son, and then mitochondrial DNA. So these are, that's DNA that everyone inherits from their mother. And it's at the time quite expensive. And the results are pretty crude and not terribly informative. And so it's kind of this niche product. You're not getting your, like whole lists of present day cousins, at least not close ones. You're not getting your sense of where your maternal and paternal family all came from in an ethnicity chart. It's not that user friendly. And so it's really appealing to a small group of people who have the money and the willingness to work with this kind of information. And then, 10 years in, autosomal DNA comes on the scene. And autosomal DNA is such a game changer because it is so much more useful when you're doing your genealogy. It's not these ancient migration paths. It's like immediate information. It's like third, fourth, fifth, second, first cousins, right? And then it can give you, so it's your maternal and your paternal DNA. It's your maternal and your paternal relatives, like other people who've tested at the same company, and they show up in a database as related to you. And on top of that, they can give you this ethnicity estimate, which purports to be able to tell you where in the world your people come from 500 to 1,000 years ago. And that is like such a big deal. Greenspan says, he went from going to genealogy conferences and trying to like persuade people to buy his product by like shaking their hand and not letting go, and then like walking backwards towards his booth, like kind of like almost, strong arming them into proximity to his product in hopes of selling it, to everyone knows about it. And part of what happened is that companies like Ancestry and 23andMe, but especially Ancestry, put an enormous amount of money into advertising it. And they found this kind of formula, which really appealed to Americans, this idea of like, your long lost ancestors and seeking your own authentic self by understanding the past and where you come from. There's really pervasive sense in the US for a lot of people that our Americanness is like only part of us, but there's like some additional identity that we could get if we knew where we came from. And a lot of Americans don't know where they come from. which seems weird to some of us, right, who've spent a lot of time in the paper records, but true, right? They might not even know where their grandparents come from. And then it kind of moves out of the realm of, just this kind of niche item into the world of the casual consumer. And that brings with it people who don't even know what they're testing for. They're just testing for that ethnicity estimate pie chart. They don't even know they're going to get their list of relatives. And it's, becomes like a gift that you give for the holidays, which, by the way, is how I got my first DNA test kit. It's like the gift you get for the person in your life who already has everything. And as a result, sometimes we don't realize the kind of profundity of the act that we are potentially engaging in. Now, for most of us, it might not be a big deal. But for others, the fact that it's kind of framed as entertainment and recreation maybe potentially does them a disservice, right? Because they don't actually get the terms of the exchange, right? They think that the investment is $59 or whatever it is on sale, which, by the way, yes, you can get it at 59. I've seen it as low as 49, right? The investment can be much greater than that. The investment can be, in fact, your whole identity, right? Depending on what you find. And you don't know what you're going to find till you do it. So it's this crazy kind of venture that we're all engaging in.
Life-altering gift potentially for $49.
Right.
So
potentially, but you don't know, right?
Yeah. We just talked about the past. Let's talk about the future. And you just referenced 23andMe and Ancestry. And my understanding from your book is that the home DNA testing sales are gradually declining. The boom period seems to be over.
Right.
So what do you see as the future of the industry?
Right. So sales are still going up, but they're not climbing at this ridiculous rate, in part because you can't possibly sustain that, right? If you look at the slope of sales, it's practically like a steep cliff. You wouldn't want to fall off of it. And now it's still going up, but it's not going up as rapidly. So when I started writing the book in the summer of 2017, there were 8 million DNA test kits sold, and now we're at just about 40 million. So in 4 years, we went from 8 to 40. And yet also at the same time, you do see a slowdown. So, there's this, they're not doubling the database size in a year, right? And they can't because the numbers are so big at this point too. So what's interesting is sort of the different paths that seem to be, taken. 23andMe is kind of doubling down on health-related research. They're the company that's most known for this. They've always had that as part of their mission from the very beginning. In fact, Ancestry was almost just it was never their emphasis. It became their emphasis at a certain point because they ceased to be able to offer the health-related information because of some disputes with the FDA at a certain point. But they always had their eye on the idea that if they could get a lot of people's permission to use their genes for research, and then also have those people volunteer a lot of information about themselves, so they could get the genotypic data and the phenotypic data, which is how the kind of genes present themselves, that they could essentially in some way kind of crowdsource solutions to health problems. And then they could, getting 10 million people or however many to consent to have their DNA used for research isn't going to happen in many settings. There's not many labs or academic centers where you can get that many people. 23andMe has that, right? So they can really, it's kind of amazing. They can really get masses and massive information and study it, and then try to develop pharmaceuticals, develop solutions to certain cancers. That's sort of where they're coming at it. And that's where they see that future as much more lucrative than just family history research. And then Ancestry, on the other hand, and those are the two biggest companies, has really, they dabbled in health and they kind of stepped back. And they seem to be doubling down on the idea of selling their product family history research, which is going to be interesting because the question will be, can they, how much they need to broaden their market abroad in order to keep, selling kits and getting subscribers, because really 23andMe also wants to sell those subscriptions to their incredible genealogical database. I mean, it's got tens of billions of records in it. So they, yeah, that's kind of their model is very different from 23andMe.
So let's get personal for a second. You just said a few minutes ago that you've been given a DNA home test as a gift, and so did you have any surprising results that you'd like to share?
Yeah. So I mean, I got my first kid in late 2016, and then I tested at a couple of other companies. And I mean, I think the first thing I want to say is that, I mean, as a journalist who's talked to a lot of people, I'm kind of aware of the nuances of this, right? Like that it can be complicated. Um, at the same time, the vast majority of people I've talked to who discovered something unexpected about their own origins told me they were ultimately glad to know. So that's kind of amazing, right? Even when it was painful. That's not always true of the people on the other side. But it's not, DNA testing is not black and white, right? It's not like, I think there are some journalists who are kind of like, beware, don't ever open that Pandora's box. I don't see it that way, because my own personal experience with it has been that it is incredibly illuminating. That you can find out things by using DNA coupled with the paper records that you can't find out any other way. And that's what we found in my family. We found long lost cousins on both sides who illuminated chapters in our history that we would never have discovered any other way. And then we made contact with them. On my father's side, he is part Swedish. And he was mostly primarily raised by his Swedish grandmother here in the US. And didn't know much about her. Knew that she emigrated in the 1890s when she was a teenager. Knew that she was probably leaving some poverty, but we didn't kind of know much beyond that, and didn't have any connection to Sweden at all. And then through DNA testing, we actually found some of our Swedish cousins who, had tested there. They live in Sweden and they had tested. One of them specifically had tested. And we made contact with them. And what's fascinating about it is we would not have known they existed because there was a kind of a break in the line, like an NPE, up the chain. And so sometimes DNA can tell you things that the paper record doesn't because you didn't even know to look for it, right? And that's the case with these branches of our family. And so we started talking, and it turned out that one of our cousins was a genealogist, of course. That's why she was doing DNA testing. And she had compiled an enormous amount of information about our family. It was incredibly rich. And after kind of emailing with her for a few years, we realized we wanted to go to Sweden and meet her. And we wanted to see where my dad's grandmother's life had taken place. And so this is where it becomes like some sort of, I don't know, Hallmark movie. We went there, right? And we met her, and we met her mother. Her mother is my dad's second cousin. And when you think about second cousin, it's not actually that distant of a relation, but it goes back really far in time. And that kind of jarred me, that idea that the past wasn't actually so far away, and that these living cousins who were not that distant could be our like immediate connection to that past. I just found that absolutely incredible, right? Then we had a historian take us around, and he was able to show us kind of the outlines of my dad's grandmother's life. So we saw the foundations of her farmhouse. We saw the school that she attended, which is still there. We saw the church where she worshiped, which is still an active church. We found the old wooden desks that they sat at, right? So I don't know if she sat at these particular desks. They had like a few of them still sitting up there in storage. And but that was a desk that she would have sat at, or she and her peers, and we kind of picked them up, and we looked on the graffiti because the kids had scratched their names, and we like wondered it. We didn't find her name, but it was like this wow. It was like this unbelievable wow. She's had an incredible effect on my life, even though I never met her, right? I live in a very small town. She settled here long ago as a domestic, and I live here through this accident of history that she happened to come here, right? So I feel like DNA testing, as complicated as it can be for people, is also like a kind of it gives us access to the past, and it tells us things we couldn't otherwise know. And it sometimes explains to us how we got here, right? And it shows us how our ancestors shaped our lives in ways that we never even realized. And that's the profound kind of revelation to me, is that we live in this moment in 2021 when you, for $59 or whatever, you can send in your spit and they crack open your cells and they tell you what's there, right? I mean, I just think that's absolutely incredible. So that's been my personal experience with DNA testing.
All right, so I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Okay, so I want the audience to be ready to ask questions. Okay, I'm counting on you, audience. If not, I'll ask some more questions, but I'd really like to get some audience engagement. All right, so my last question to you, I think it's appropriate to end on this one for me. What advice do you have for people who are thinking of getting a home DNA test?
Yeah, I mean, I think, given how intertwined our lives are and how intertwined our genetics are with people in our family, it's a really good question to ponder, because in many ways, the advice I used to give was like, think carefully, because you don't know what you're going to find, and like it could be amazing and really informative, and it could be more than you are ready for. So make sure you're ready for the potential of it. But I don't know that advice really resonates. I mean, first of all, you can make these discoveries sometimes because somebody else has tested, right? Second of all, nobody really thinks it's going to happen to them. We think we know what there is to know about our families. It would be really bizarre if you went into a DNA test and you thought, what if I'm about to discover something that upends my whole sense of who I am and my family, right? Like, nobody goes into it that way. And they do give these little advisories, and people don't necessarily think that they apply to them. So I think the advice I give now is more so for like that older generation who might be in possession of knowledge about the way their children came into the world that their children themselves don't know. And that is that, this may be the moment to consider getting in front of that and talking to your children before they find out by a DNA test, because, it's that history is a different, past is a different country, and past culture has a ton of context to it, a ton of reasons why people made the decisions that they made about how they brought their children into the world and what they chose to tell them and how they wanted to protect them, to not have them be ostracized or not have themselves be ostracized, right? There's all sorts of reasons why, given past stigmas, people didn't tell their children. And the opportunity to contextualize and explain it is very important, because nowadays, you could have a person taking a DNA test and just being really, really angry that they were never told. And so those conversations are incredibly important. And God forbid your child finds out after you've passed away and they can't ask you those crucial questions. I've interviewed people who can't ask their parents anymore because their parents died a few years before they made the discovery. And that's incredibly painful to never know. Why did you choose not to tell me? Or how did I come into the world? Was I donor conceived, or did you have a relationship with someone else? I'll understand, but please give me some context for how I came to exist. And so that the advice I would give is to consider the possibility of having those conversations. And I would say that there are more therapists and mental health professionals and mediators and genetic counselors than ever who are available to hold your hand with those conversations, because this is such a widespread phenomenon that if you need that kind of help, that you could probably find someone to walk you through it.
Excellent, Libby. Thank you so much for your thoughtful response to that question and to all my questions. So at this time, let's start by doing this. If there's anyone on the line who would like to ask a question via audio or video and wants to unmute themselves, they can do so now. So we'll give it a few seconds. Renee, it looks like you unmuted. Did you want to ask a question to Libby?
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
I have a quick technical question and then a different kind of question. When you do this, do you get updates over time? Because obviously more people are being tested all the time. So you might have, 100 more cousins that show up in a year or something. How does that happen?
Yeah, you do. You get these, you have 26 new relatives in the last week or whatever. Yeah, and you also get updates to your ethnicity estimate, which is an imperfect estimate. And so as they get better and they roll out new updates, they'll tell you about that.
Okay. And then the other question was, I had a doctor tell me once that this is not a great idea to do because there's a lot of risk around medical insurance and medical companies finding out things that could jeopardize or mean that your insurance costs a lot more. I suppose the same, I'm really not interested in like life insurance, but I suppose the same thing would go for that type of thing. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's
In
a
terms of
great question.
the negative risks of doing
Definitely.
this.
Definitely. So remember how I was talking about like the problems of prognosticating, right? Like we're bad fortune tellers when it comes to technology. And so, you know, that's a concern, but we haven't seen it play out yet. So are there people who will say this is definitely a risk? Absolutely. There is some federal legislation. It's called GINA, and it protects you from certain kinds of genetic discrimination when it comes to insurance and employment. But there are other kinds. There are loopholes within that, and then there are other kinds of insurance that are not protected unless your state happens to have filled the gap. So life, long-term care, disability. How would an insurer find out this information? That's sort of part of the question, right? Could they ask you? Yeah, they could potentially at some point ask you and say, like, have you ever taken any kind of genetic test, direct to consumer or through a doctor's office, like whatever. And you could sort of be, I guess, contractually obligated if you wanted their insurance to answer and to answer truthfully, or else your contract would be considered void if they ever found out. But how would they find out, right? So these are all those questions, right? I talked to a bioethicist who said, like, he believes that this is definitely going to happen. And I also combed the record for instances where it had happened and I couldn't find one. That doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. It means I couldn't find it. And doesn't mean it won't happen. But as far as we know, I can't point to any examples of it happening yet. So that's sort of enough of an abstraction that a lot of people don't worry about it. But, we've been surprised before.
That was a great question, Renee. See, that last question she asked, those are the questions I'm talking about, folks. I'm sure you have questions like that as well. Renee, did you have anything else you wanted to add real quick?
Just, you're talking more like long-term care insurance, or you think it applies to regular insurance as well?
So life, long-term care, and disability, as I recall, are the ones that are not protected by GINA.
Okay.
Whereas like health insurance and employment, which is not a type of insurance, but just employment matters, are supposed to be, genetic discrimination in those arenas are supposed to be outlawed by this legislation, which passed some time ago.
How do you spell the name of that legislation?
GINA, G-I-N-A.
Okay.
Like the genetic, I won't try to tell you what it stands for, but the first word is genetic, and it's insurance or information. Okay. Yeah, GINA, G-I-N-A.
So even there might be loopholes that would only be okay if your state somehow filled in.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Renee, for the questions.
These companies, they want to protect your information because that's where they get the promise of the continuing consumer, right? In other words, if we know it's threatened, we're not going to take their test anymore, right? So their butts are on the line. On the other hand, as with the case of the rise of investigative and genetic genealogy, we can see that the protections are not perfect. So you have that kind of push-pull.
And of course,
sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and then of course, everyone on earth has had their, credit card, whatever, stolen.
Right.
That's not to say somebody couldn't break in and capture all that good info too.
Right.
Did they separate in some way?
That's another question, right? Could this information be breached? And then how vulnerable are you? Like, how informative is that information, right? It's uniquely yours. And yeah, again, it's one of those that hasn't happened yet, but it could happen. There have been some breaches, but not, as far as I know, no breaches of genetic data by any of the major companies. So it's not perfect. And then there's a lot of third-party sites where protections are not as good. So if you're downloading your information from one spot, uploading it to another, it's definitely something you want to investigate. And if you're concerned in general about protections, it really behooves you to look at the different companies' policies. I know that sounds time-consuming and boring, but like they have different ways by means by which they can be accessed or not accessed. Some of them have kind of relatively tighter security. So, and as we're waiting for the next question, I'm going to just mention that I have like a newsletter where I write, like occasionally I'll write an op-ed on race and reconciliation and DNA testing for the New York Times. I did that a few months ago, where I'll write about like Father's Day and DNA and fatherhood or whatever. I send them out occasionally, like once a month or less, through this newsletter. So I'm putting that in the chat. And I'm also listing that the book, where the book's available, it just came out in paperback. So it's very cheap on Amazon, but you can also get a signed copy through an independent bookstore near my house if you're willing to pay for shipping. So anyway, I'm putting that all up in the chat if you're interested.
Great. So folks, make sure to take a peek at the chat in the next 5 minutes or so. Did anyone else have any questions for Libby? Wayne, I see that you just unmuted. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, if I've gotten a DNA test and I'm looking into genealogy, what are the advantages of having older generation tested as well? And if there are advantages to that, how do you gently go about asking them to spit in a cup?
Yeah. So I'm not a genetic genealogist, but the genetic genealogists I know say there's definitely an advantage to having the older generation because, relatives kind of drop off over time, right? So you could have, for instance, a fourth or fifth cousin who doesn't show up as genetically related to you because you don't share enough DNA with them because of the way DNA is distributed, right? But they will show up as related to a parent. Does that make sense? Because they're more closely related. So having the parent tested means that you're going to find some relatives that you might not otherwise find, and it means it's going to be relatively easier to go back in the historical record if you're trying to do that genealogical research. And then as far as like that gentle, how do you ask? So this is actually like an ethical question, right? C.C. Moore, who you may have heard of, she's a kind of prominent genetic genealogist. She says that she used to kind of encourage people, she used to give them techniques for how to convince their older relatives to test. And then she realized that wasn't a good idea, right? Because if people felt pressured into doing something and perhaps were hesitant because of privacy concerns or maybe family secrets and things that, that maybe didn't need to come out or they didn't want to come out, and then that came out as a result of them testing, she said that would kind of she didn't want to give the field a bad name, right? She didn't want to have people have that bad experience. And I have found that in general, agency is important. So if you feel like it was your choice, you feel a lot better about whatever it is you find. So I'm going to say that, right? And so that's kind of my main advice. If you're interested and somebody seems willing, but they just don't know how to go about it, or they want to be reassured about, certain things, there are, I would say there are ways of getting around certain privacy issues. So for instance, you can have the person test and then you can look at their results and then you can delete their kit. Now you're not then going to get updated information, but that might feel better to them, right? If they just want their ethnicity results and they don't want to see their DNA relatives, they can opt out of seeing them and those people won't find them. I don't know how genealogically useful that would be to you, but it would mean that it would protect their privacy. And if you're only looking for ethnicity information, then that could be a benefit.
Does that answer your question, Marianne?
Yeah.
Great. Sorry I called you Wayne, by the way. I didn't see you hiding in the corner at first.
I was hiding.
That's okay. All right. Let's see. We're closing in on 8 o'clock. Let's take one last audience question. Does anyone else on the line have a question for Libby? If you do, you can unmute and ask now.
I've answered every question.
It looks like it. Renee, did you have one last question for Libby?
Yes, sure. Follow up on your question, Robert, which is future. So does DNA testing do everything you could possibly want now, or do you picture it evolving in a way that gives some other types of information that we can't get today?
I mean, they're constantly getting better at these ethnicity estimates, and that's partly a function of the reference populations getting bigger, right? So they have these reference populations stand in for all of a particular region. Those groups get bigger, and as they get bigger, the companies get better at defining what does it look like to be XYZ, and what are the granularities of that, particular county within a particular country. They get more and more granular. They also are constantly unveiling these new things where they try to kind of predict where, how you're related to someone. So they'll give you these trees and they show you, and it's kind of amazing, right? It almost kind of in some ways does the work for you. It's not always perfectly right. But that's something that it seems to be happening more and more, is that they're trying to do the genealogical work for you. They're trying to kind of put together the DNA information with the trees that exist out there to kind of explain to you how you're linked to someone without you having to do quite so much of the work.
Does that answer your question, Renee?
So, yeah, mostly, but that sounds like the change is in how they're dealing with the data, not that the test will get more sensitive or capture different data. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, the ethnicity information, is partly reference population, it's partly algorithm. And then eventually, yes, I mean, we may move away from genotyping to capturing more of the genome, right? We're only capturing a small proportion of it. So eventually when sequencing becomes inexpensive enough, then that's what we're going to be looking at. And that could be much more richly informative, because then you're looking at the entire genome and not just a small portion of it.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Renee. Thank you, Marianne, for the questions. I have to go help Amelia Earhart bring her things out to her van. Long story. But I do want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Corning Foundation, which I neglected to do at the beginning, for co-sponsoring tonight's event. I want to encourage folks to sign up for Libby's newsletter, and please visit her website, and please consider purchasing an autographed copy of her new paperback. The library does have one copy of the hardcover, but it's currently checked out. So there you go, Libby. So Libby, do you have any last words to the group before we wrap up?
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it, and what a great group. It was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Libby. Thank you all so much for joining us, and look for that email from me tomorrow morning. Everyone have a great rest of your night. Bye-bye.